Excuse me, sir, are you into of the history? Because today's mod is all about history. We'll be covering Voltaire's Nightmare, a complete overhaul for EU4. If we get 10,000 likes on this video, I'm also going to be covering an alternate history mod that is also quite popular in recent months. And consider subscribing if you enjoyed the channel. Only a small percentage of you have subscribed, and by subscribing you encourage me to make more videos like these in the future. So the first thing you probably noticed is that we don't have the entirety of the world. We only have Europe, parts of the Middle East, and North Africa. The reason why this is one of the most historically accurate mods for EU4 is because they've actually recreated pretty much all the small provinces in Germany. It started out as a mod focused on the Germanic region with an emphasis on the Holy Roman Empire, which is why this is the closest we'll ever get to a historical layout of the nations within the Holy Roman Empire, or better yet, various duchies, counties, archbishoprics, etc, etc, because at the end of the day, they were not really independent, were they? They were a part of the HRE. Before we actually get into the game, I want to mention that they've got a few start dates. The main start date in 1054 is the Great Schism, which is when the Great Ecumenical Council happened, and that's when Catholicism and Orthodoxy came to be. Prior to this, there was a lot more religions in Europe. There were basically Christian religions, and you can still see them around. We still have Paulician, Bogomilist, and you probably know the Bogomilist rebels from the base EU4. We also have Iconoclasts, Miaphysites, Nestorians. The reality is that Christianity split into two branches in 1054. Prior to that, there was way more. So it's a good thing that at least eventually it became two different branches, right? The other ones eventually died out, even though there are still small pockets in parts of the world that follow these religions. The second start date, and this is my personal favorite start date, is the 1099 start date, which is the first crusade start date, and which in our timeline had a massive impact on the world that we know today, and they do try to portray this as best as possible in the mod, and they have done a pretty solid job in my opinion with it. We have the nation of Antioch, which is of course a Christian crusader state, as well as a lot of other nations in these areas that are pretty accurately depicted. Christianity has a more firmer grasp on its land with less heretics around. The Reconquista in Spain is definitely kicking off, having taken more than half of the lands compared to the 1054 start date. The HRE continues its expansion, this time into the east, with the eventual colonization and cultural conversion of these lands to Germanic, let's say. This is also the period when the Cumans were at their highest from a power point of view, and also when the Byzantines were trying to take back the land that they started to lose after the Battle of Manzikert. Here's a little insight: they eventually lost these wars and disappeared. Don't tell anyone, okay? You might recognize the third start date, as it is the period when the Kingdom of Heaven movie was filmed. Essentially, it is the struggles of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Here's a little bit more foreshadowing: Jerusalem also falls. Don't tell anyone. Our secret. I like the fact that they've actually done quite a little bit of research, historically speaking, when it comes to the map. If we go to the Germanic area, which is the main focus of the mod, by the way, you can see that the Germans have started to colonize these areas, let's say, pushed out the Slavs considerably, and the nation of Brandenburg already has formed as the Margraviat of Brandenburg. Essentially, it's a sort of a march by the border of the empire with the purpose of defending and converting the lands to Germanic lands, let's say. In Spain, not much progress from the Crusaders, but we do see some familiar faces: Aragon, Castile, Leon, and Galicia. Castile eventually would take over both Leon and Galicia, and even the nation of Biscay, whilst Morocco would crumble into 1,000 little pieces shortly after the start date. Culturally speaking, you can see a much better depiction of the culture of Anatolia here, with the Greeks basically dominating the coastlines and the Turkish taking a foothold in the central part of Anatolia. And this is pretty much the cultural layout of this area for a very long time to come. In the 19th to 20th century, the massive changes would occur, but until that point, this is kind of what it looked like for about 500 years. Next is the Latin Empire start date, which is essentially the failed Fourth Crusade, the crusade that was meant to take back the Holy Lands after the fall of Jerusalem. But what really happened is, because of Venetian influence, they've basically taken Constantinople and as such completely destroyed the Byzantine Empire, which fell apart, and you have the Empire of Trebizond, the Empire of Nicaea, Epirus, and so on. All of these are basically successor states to the Byzantines. Eventually, Nicaea takes back Constantinople from the Latin Empire and restores Byzantium, but at the same time, Trebizond, even in the 1444 start date, still claims to be the real Byzantine Empire, essentially, with the dynasty in Trebizond being the dynasty that was ousted by the Latin Empire prior to this particular start date. We also have Thessalonica, which is another crusader nation, Athens as well, a crusader nation, as is Achaea and a few others in these areas. The Venetians have taken their foothold here, small cities in Gallipoli and Rodosto being occupied by them. Later on, once the Ottomans form in this area that I'm highlighting right now, after their initial conquest by the coastline, Gallipoli will be one of the first cities to fall to the Ottomans. So I hope you're proud of yourself, Venice. You fucked everything up for everybody, okay? On the bright side, this is also the period when the Bulgarian Empire was at one of its highest points in history. Eventually, they would even form a dual empire with the Wallachians in this area. And also around this time is when the Hungarians started to heavily colonize the Transylvanian parts, with the Zekeli Magyars being sent a while before the start date to start the colonization process. They also sent the Saxon Germanic immigrants to these parts, as well as even tried to get the Teutons to establish some fortifications and stay in these areas, but later on the Teutons decided to move on to where we know the Teutons to historically have lived for quite a while. I'm not gonna lie, there's a few more start dates here that are quite interesting. Honestly, I'm really happy with the amount of research they've done. They even have the 1399 start date, which is the default start date for EU3, and it is also a super good start date. And even the Golden Bull start date, which again is a super amazing one that I personally thought would have been a better start date for EU4, and hopefully it's going to be the start date for EU5. A little sub note here, I've actually started working on the EU5 video, and there's a lot of research I'm doing as I want to present facts for that video. So let me know in the comment section if you guys are interested in watching that video or interested in the topic. Let's go back to the 1054 start date, as this is the main start date, and let's actually play the game, shall we? I actually love the fact that they took the time to even write the intros for each nation here, or at least for most of the nations, right? With a little bit of historical background so you understand what exactly was happening at the time in these areas. Now I have to mention that if you start as the Byzantines, be ready for a lot of failures, because it's kind of scripted that you're going to get a lot of particular modifiers to ensure your downfall. You're going to be cut in size massively as the years progress. Got a pretty decent mission tree, and a lot of nations do have mission trees, which are not simply just get a claim on this game, get a claim on that. They're actually quite in-depth and really interesting missions to follow. There's a lot of new aspects and decisions that I recommend, if you guys play the game, take some time at the start to go through, because these can be quite important, especially from the early game. So you want to be sure that you know what you're doing. There are some modifiers that the Byzantines start with, such as general cost increase, manpower decrease, as well as shattered army, which lowers your morale of armies, vulnerable frontiers, bad bureaucracy that increases advisor cost, maintenance cost, and lowers admin efficiency. Honestly, the amount of negative modifiers that you start with is just insanely horrible. So good luck if you start as the Byzantines. You'll need it. You do get the Byzantine monarchy government type, which is fixed to the empire rank, and you get a lot of governing capacity from it, so that's a nice touch on their part. You also have 0 crownlands from the beginning, so you will definitely struggle to get your crownlands back. As you can imagine, there's new ages in the game. You start in the Age of Empire, eventually get the Age of Holy Wars, Age of Crisis, Dynasticism, and then the regular ages that we have in EU4, with an added Age of Ideology at the end of the game if you do decide to play all the way to 1820s. Obviously, each of these ages have their specific bonuses. In the early one, the Seljuks are pretty strong as it is, but they're getting a lot of bonuses even from here. Starting the Golden Era has a start button, so remember that that's a little bit different compared to vanilla. There's a few new buildings, such as the medical buildings, which include the apothecary and the hospice, as well as the college added for the education before you can get the universities. You also get 3 levels for production, taxation, and government, starting with the watchman, courthouse, all the way to the town hall. hall, as well as artisan, workshop, and counting house. You also have a road network that you can add, which can be upgraded to a guild, armory, port, and you can even get ramparts separately from the manufactories. I really like the building system that they added, and I think it works pretty well. It adds a lot of needed flavor in the early game before the buildings that we're used to in 1444 even appear. So obviously the first thing I want to do is talk a little bit about the historical accuracy of the 1054 map. We're going to start with the political, and I have to say it is extremely well done from a political perspective. There are some minor things that are debatable, let's say, but overall, out of pretty much any mod that I've seen on U4 so far, this is the most well done from a political perspective. You even have the most accurate depiction of the Balkans, which is one of the hardest things to do in any map game, and I think my Balkan brothers know very well why. On the 26th of August 1071, which is roughly 20 years from now, a famous battle will happen in Manzikert, which is this province over here, between the Seljuks and the Byzantines, and from that moment onwards, the Byzantines are basically going to start continuously losing their lands in the Anatolian parts until they get reduced to the one city in Constantinople and eventually taken out completely. By the way that they made Constantinople is perfect because these are actually the regular borders of the city of Constantinople, with the Galatea area on the other side of the Golden Horde over here. You also get the Theodosian walls at the start, which I'm personally really happy to see was added here. 200% defensiveness, that is actually massive. One thing I do have to say is the fact that in this particular area, there's not 100% accuracy. I would say there were a little bit more countries here. I know Vladimir was a massive principality in the period, but they did have a lot of smaller principalities around this particular area, and even in the Ryazan side, which I'm not sure why they are not portrayed. It might have something to do with the fact that the game, as it is insanely clunky, and that's probably the biggest complaint of people, that if you don't have a super good computer, you're gonna struggle to play this, as it takes a lot out of anybody's computer, even my computer. As you can imagine, in the Iberian parts, the Reconquista has a long way to go before they actually manage to take back all of the Iberian areas. Not 100% sure there was this many Sunnis in Iberia at the time. I mean, of course, the nobility and the ones in charge of these countries were 100% Sunni, right? But the people living here were not as Sunni as you would imagine, especially in the northern parts. The reason the Reconquista happened was basically to liberate the Christians from these areas, from the overlords, which were obviously not Christian. But still, I'm happy to see that they did represent this pretty accurately. A lot of separate emirates sprang out after, as you would imagine, dynastic infighting, which is the cause of all problems in the Middle Ages after all. My favorite is the fact that France is actually super well depicted, even though it looks like there's one nation here because they made most of the vassals have the same or similar color to the French. If you click on France and you go to diplomatic map mode, these are all the provinces that the French crown directly owned. The rest of these were basically feudal lords that had to follow whatever the French king said. They're not vassals, they are fiefs, which is a different kind of vassal specific to this region. And my lord, are there a lot of them, which makes for a very, very interesting game. The HRE itself is massively populated by so many freaking small OPMs, it's insane. Look at this, we got Arenberg, which has one city there, and it's got another city in Arenberg, a little bit to the side, and that's a common thing actually in the HRE. A lot of nations are basically divided. They have one fiefdom over here, another fiefdom over there. The reason for this is because this shows the lands that certain nobles had within the Holy Roman Empire. These were not technically independent countries as you would imagine, and were basically as if in today's age certain people owned the land in here and land in there, and they had more control over those lands than they do in today's age. Of course, that's basically how the feudal system was, where landowner was the thing that granted you power over other people essentially. My favorite is Mainz. Look at this. Mainz has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 separate provinces from each other. So if they were not a part of the HRE, they wouldn't have any way of moving between their provinces. Culturally speaking, there are some things I am not 100% on board with, but I'm super happy to see that they did depict the Rhenish culture. This is a culture that still exists today in the south part of Switzerland. We have the Romansh speaking people of Switzerland, which basically is a Latin descended language that is on the verge of extinction in today's today's age, but still existed back then. And you see they have the Friulian dialect of Romansh, the Latin one as well present. Much better culturally divided areas, with the Dutch being separate from the Germans, the Slovaks being a part of the West Slavic group together with Kashubian, Polabian, and Sorbian, Lithuanian and Latvian being separate from Estonian, which is a part of the Karelian and the Finnish area. Then we also have the Bretons, which are in the same culture group with the Irish, the various Highlander, Scottish tribes, as well as the Welsh and the Cornish, and even Manx, right? Yep, they have Manx as well. 100 extra social credit for that, by the way. Basque is separate from everything else, as you would imagine, because they're a completely different language with their own customs. They should be separate. And the fact is that in this mod, it's okay because they don't have one province. They actually have a huge amount of provinces. And by the way, you can have up to 10, if I'm not mistaken, provinces in one state, or in any case, a lot more than 5, which is the case with the base vanilla EU4. The south tip of Italy has a lot of Greek influence, which is accurate actually during this period. And there's a lot of A-Romanians, which is part of the Eastern Romance language group. A-Romanians with Megleno-Romanians and Istro-Romanians and Dalmato-Romanians, basically Dalmatians in the base EU4 game, are very similar when it comes to language to the regular Romanian spoken in Romania today. Dalmatian eventually went extinct, but we still have Megleno, A-Romanian, and Istro-Romanian. I have to say that this is a little bit too much A-Romanian in my opinion. The reality is they did exist in this area in Greece and the south of Bulgaria, and they mostly inhabited the mountain areas. They were mostly shepherds and goat herders in the mountains, but this seems like a lot more than I think should happen. I mean, the reality is they were always a minority and struggled to survive, and even today are a minority and are struggling to survive. So I'm not sure there were this many of them during the 1054 start date. If you're wondering why there's Latin speaking people in Greece and Bulgaria, it's because back when the Roman Empire was still Latin, of course, a sizable amount of Latin speaking people existed in the Eastern Roman Empire as well. And by the time that the Eastern Roman Empire decided that it will switch to Greek as its primary and official language, the Latin minority was still around. They didn't just automatically switch to Greek, and they kept their language and their identity throughout the Balkan areas. Eventually, they mostly got assimilated by especially the Slavs. The Slavs were super into assimilating the Latin-speaking people once they came to these parts. The Greeks not so much, to be fair, which is why there's a lot more of them in Greece even today. Wallachia is extremely well shown. There were a lot of smaller pre-Wallachian entities, feudal states essentially, that eventually merged and formed the nation of Wallachia. The same thing goes for Moldova. They did merge once the Hungarians sent over a group from Transylvania to form a march that was a vassal of the Hungarian crown, which is exactly what happened eventually. And guys, don't mistake this Romani for the migrating Indian people that came from India, which also are called Romani, because it's not the same thing. And if you make that mistake, get the fuck out of my channel, please. Never come back, goddamn. As I showed earlier, there's a lot more religions here. So 1054 is essentially the date when the Catholic and Orthodox churches were established, basically. And I just realized there's a lot of Tengri here. I know that the Hungarians were Tengri. I just had no idea there was this many Tengri in 1054. That's a little bit weird. The Hungarians got converted to Catholicism with Stefan I, I believe, was the first Catholic king of Hungary, but I know that they had an intense period of conversion when that happened. So it's kind of surprising to see this many Tengri here. I would imagine there were still Tengris in the area, but not this many, and especially not in the Hunedoara and Hatzeg area, which were predominantly Orthodox at the time, as was the majority of Transylvania. The Severin area was also, I would say, a little bit more mixed. I would go as far as to say that the south part of this was Serbian more than Hungarian, but then again, setting the limit at the river here by the Danube River is not a bad idea either. The thing in the mod though is the fact that we have Asatru, which is the Norse religion still around in Sweden. It's in fact the official religion of Sweden at the start date. So if you want to play as the Norse and conquer the rest of the world as the Norse in name of Odin and Thor, this is your chance to do it. This mod offers you that exact chance to do it. There's also a lot of new religions like the Rodnoveri, Druvi, Romuva, Dievuturi, Mausko, and Suomensko in the Baltic areas. So there's a lot of flavor here that you can play play as if you want to. We also have the Uralinusko, which I've never heard of before, so that's interesting. Hostile core creation on us plus 25. That's a really good one to have to piss off other nations. And we even have some of the pre-Christian religions in the Caucasus that nations like Circassia had before they became Orthodox and later on Sunni. So if you're looking to play a mod that is both historically accurate and super entertaining with a ton of events and new missions, then try this one out. You'll find the link in the description. I highly recommend you do. But remember that you're gonna need a NASA computer to play with this one, so keep that in mind. And don't forget, for 10,000 likes, we'll be covering an alternate history mod, and consider subscribing if you enjoyed the channel. It would really help me out so much. Also, if you're wondering how historically accurate the 1444 map date is, check out this video right over here. You'll find your answer. And I want to give a very big thank you to all of my channel members, Patreon members, as well as my Twitch supporters. I really wouldn't be able to do this without all of your support. You guys are absolutely amazing.